Welcome, gentlemen. Hello, good morning, everyone. How are you? Excellent. My name is Amna Nawaz. I'm co-anchor of the PBS NewsHour. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. Thank you so much, Interim President Groves, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to our esteemed panelists as well. We have a lot to cover, and we're going to save time for audience questions as well. So if there's anything I don't ask them about, anything they don't cover in their remarks, please feel free. I think we'll have microphones coming around towards the end of the session. Raise your hand, and you'll be able to put your questions to our panelists. The conversation today is on the new political order, the view from around the globe. It's quite a big topic. We have three incredible panelists to help us break it all down. I want you to help me, please, in welcoming Joel Hellman, who's the Dean of the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Dean Hellman. Manuel Muniz, who's Provost of IE University based in Madrid. We're so happy to have you here. And Daniel Byman, of course, Professor at the Department of Government here at Georgetown University. Thank you all for being here. So, just to set this table a little bit, obviously we all know from political polarization to populist movements, we're seeing a realignment, a rebalancing of post-war alliances. It's clear that we live in a world in flux, a time of political disruption, great power competition, and the uncertainty of our time, I think, seems to be a defining feature. We've also seen a number of political and small d democratic systems being tested like never before. So I want to jump into all of this. First, Dean Hellman, to allow you to kick us off here with your opening statement. Each of our panelists will make a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll jump in with conversation to follow. So how are you viewing this time of great uncertainty and this moment?
Wow, where do I start? I'm viewing it as a time of great uncertainty. That I can tell you. I have been dean here now for over 10 years. And when I arrived at Georgetown, thinking at the start of my deanship, how was I going to think about the priorities of our school relating to what's happening globally? And one of the first things I talked about was, well, great power competition is over. It's not really an interesting question anymore. That was 10 years ago. Boy, was I wrong. And I think one of the most interesting moments that we're in is there has been a tremendous shift and change in the kind of core pillars that have defined the post-war global order. America's role in the world is changing, both in terms of its economic and political power, its willingness and commitment to traditional alliances, and its relationship to core competitors. The nature of those core competitors has changed. And the defining feature of the current moment, at least in the dialogue that we're sort of seeing, is discussion of essentially a new form of great power competition. And it's often spoken about in terms of a new Cold War. And I see that as a potentially a very damaging way of thinking about where this new order is shaping up. The way I see Cold War and the new Cold War rhetoric, I see it like a pair of sort of slippers that was in the back of your closet that you rediscovered after many, many years, and you put them back on and goes, I remember how comfortable these slippers were. I remember how easy it was to see the world in terms of a significant degree of a block-oriented competition between two systems, and I use the word systems very decidedly, two different political systems, different economic systems, different ideological systems that are competing with each other. That was the way we were comfortable viewing the world during the Cold War period. That is the way of viewing the world collapsed with the end of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. But we are back now again reanimating the Cold War rhetoric, the Cold War dialogue, the Cold War framework to think about the current environment. And in my view, this is damaging in a number of ways. First of all, This new great power competition between China and the United States has virtually no similarities to the previous Cold War. We are now talking about countries that are not sort of separated economically, that don't have truly distinctive ways of organizing their economies and their ideological viewpoints around the world. We are talking about two competitors that are deeply integrated, whose economies are deeply integrated, whose supply chains, financial chains, and other ways of engaging are very, very closely interconnected. So we are trying to use and fit into that very complex economic and political change a framework that doesn't really make sense anymore and actually pushes us in the wrong directions, because we need to be thinking about how we build a political, ideological, and security sort of system around the change in the economic relationships that have sort of shifted over time. The second thing that really concerns me about the new Cold War rhetoric is that it has essentially taken off the table anything outside of that framework of competition between great powers. And what concerns me most, and this is very relevant to what we're discussing here today, is that if you look at the dialogue happening politically, if you look at what's being reported on in the newspapers, what's being discussed, outside of the great power competition, whether it's US-China competition, whether it's wars with our former powers and Russia's invasion in Ukraine and how that's impacting, whether it's great power competition in the Middle East, everything else, development, alliance, multilateralism, these things have kind of fallen off the radar screen in our dialogue, so that policies towards Latin America, for example, policies towards Africa, policies towards South Asia, they really no longer seem to be in the front burner of our thinking about America and America's view in the world. All the effort, all the dialogue, all the interest is being sort of soaked up by this new form of great power competition. So my concern is that we've got our understanding of the great power competition wrong, and then we have taken away everything outside the great power competition off the agenda. And as a result, what really concerns me, and this is where my final point, what concerns me is that there are major shifts going on outside the world of great power competition that we are not paying attention to. That is, of course, the rise of middle powers and the importance that they play. They're demanding a voice on the global stage that befits their economic, political, and a broad role in the world. And I think we are not paying enough attention to that. That's leading to a lot of resentment, a lot of concern, a lot of looking for alternative ways of organizing the world. It means that we are not looking at some of the economic sort of shifts that are going on outside of great power competition. And what I see is increasing indebtedness. We have 2/3 of low-income countries that are now in debt to stress. We see demographic changes, especially related to Africa and South Asia, that are going to reshape the global order. The birth rates alone in Africa are going to mean an entirely new world order, and that is not on anyone's radar screen at all. The relationship between how we handle demographic changes and the economic jobs that will absorb those demographic changes. So I'm really concerned that we are leaving loads of really important issues off the table, and yet we are reframing America's role in the world in terms of a great power competition that is no longer something that really should be put into Cold War terms, and I'll leave it at that.
Dean Hillman, I asked you to paint a portrait of the world, and I think you did so. I don't know too many people who could do that so succinctly. You left a lot of room for us to jump off as well. Before I turn to Provost Muniz for your opening remarks, can I quick follow-up, though, because I've heard this argument before that we are in this Cold War 2.0. If we're not, as you seem to be arguing, what is it? Is there a new phrase for what we're in right now?
Yeah, that's the problem. We don't have an alternative, and you need an alternative to kind of clarify what this is. Look, the most important reason why the Cold War 2.0 rhetoric is not helpful, and in fact, in fact, even damaging, is that the former Cold War was not based on an economically integrated global, global system.
Ideological. Yeah.
It was ideological, it was security, it was political, right? Yes, there are ideological differences. Yes, there are political differences, undoubtedly. But they are all based on an underlying interconnectedness of economic engagement. That means that these systems cannot be, they're not two separate circuits, if you will. They are deeply integrated. What that means here, and I think much of the work is being done here at Georgetown, is that the economic interdependence allows for a weaponization of economic tools in a way that you could not have seen in Cold War 2.0. And if there is one idea that I actually think has sort of transcended and created a new paradigm, it is thinking that globalization, economic globalization, has actually created a level of economic interdependence which we thought was going to lead to peace and prosperity and closer engagements, but actually indeed can be weaponized as a form of political and even ideological and security competition in a way that we didn't doubt. So I actually think if there is one way of thinking about the world, weaponized economic interdependence might be one way of thinking about it. It's a little unwieldy. It's not as nice as Cold War.
We'll workshop that. Meanwhile, Provost Munoz, we've talked a lot, and I'm sure we will in a lot of the national discourse, the U.S. American policy, America's role in the world dominates a lot of these issues. Europe has a central role and incredibly influential role to play in all of this. Tell us about the view from Europe.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, so thank you to the colleagues at Georgetown for the invitation. It's a very, very peculiar time for Europe. It's probably one of the most significant moments in the history of European integration and the EU project, probably of the last 2 to 3 decades, for a number of reasons. But the first is because of the changing nature of the international environment. I think that there is one feature, one characteristic of what we're living, which is really the fracturing of the international system on a whole range of levels. So from the trade and economics dimension of the order. This is because of tariffs, because of tensions on supply chains, because of the regionalization of economic relations. But also there's a fracturing of the alliances and security landscape, which affects Europe very much. I'll get to this in a second. There's also a fracturing of the multilateral order with a weakening of the UN, defunding of the UN, exclusion of the UN and the multilateral system from areas of import. So Europe finds itself, having been a project that had been very much built around the notion of very radical interdependence and globalization, having to adjust to this. So there are at least 3 big areas of impact of this on the European project. One is the trade and economics piece, and I want to remind everybody here that in fact Europe is much more dependent on international trade than the US is. I mean, international trade as a proportion of our GDP is about 90-odd% of European GDP, so we're very interconnected globally. So we're very affected by shifts in international trade. The US figure for that, by the way, is about a quarter of American GDP. So these are very different degrees of exposure. The fracturing of international trade is a huge risk for Europe and its companies. I was just, in fact, a few days ago, I was in Germany speaking to one of the large German companies, to their board, and the head of strategy came up to me and he said to me, it's as if gravity had changed. So it's not just a public sector strategy through free trade deals, infrastructure, to foster interdependence, but the totality of our private sector, the most successful bits of our corporate world have engaged in this race since the end of the Second World War to build and profit from this interdependence that is now really breaking up at points, including with Russia, on some issues with China, tensions with the US. There is another economic challenge, by the way, which is very specific to Europe, and I'll finish the economy point on this, which is we seem to be underperforming the US when it comes to productivity growth and to investment and growth in frontier sectors, particularly the tech space. So since the late 1990s to today, a huge gap has emerged in productivity across the 2 economies. So we used to be roughly as productive measured in output per hours of work, and now there's a difference of 20-30 percentage points in productivity, which is very significant for Europe moving forward. Now these questions of trade and economics, they highlight what I think is going to be the big dilemma for Europe moving forward, which is the other idea that I wanted to share with you guys, which is This fracturing across all dimensions, but very significantly in the economics piece, will force Europe to decide on two paths. One is to further integrate, to perfect the European single market, which is, of course, Mario Draghi's and Enrico Letta, a friend of this institution. It's their core message in two big reports that were produced recently on one, the future of European competitiveness, and the other, the future of the single market. And by the way, Draghi has put figures on these things. So he published a very relevant piece in the FT about under a year ago, titled Forget the US. And his argument was, we're obsessed about the tariffs and the trade policy that the US thrusts upon Europe, but we're blind to our own inefficiencies. And he assessed that, in fact, imperfections in the European single market equate to tariffs to the trade of goods within the EU equivalent to 40-odd%, and over 100% in the services space. So if we ironed out these inefficiencies within Europe, our internal market would be much larger. Enrico Letta has actually now outlined 3 or 4 key sectors on energy, telecommunications, financial markets, where we could deepen European integration without even needing to tweak our treaty structures. I mean, there's space if we set the right agenda. Okay? The second area is security and defense. And here again, we also see this fracturing, which for Europe takes the form of American departure from the provision of security in Europe. And I don't want to mince words. I think this is what we're witnessing. We're witnessing, by the way, this has been a long time coming, so this is not unique to this administration. This administration is just more adamant. And I think in the next few months, we will witness, maybe the colleagues have something to say about this, but I think we will witness the actual withdrawal of US forces from Europe, particularly the most forward deployed forces that the US has. And this will reaffirm and confirm the message that has been coming out of the administration that Europe needs to take care of its own defense and security in its neighborhood. Now, I'm sure folks in the room understand, but this is a tectonic shift for Europe, because the reality is, since the end of the Second World War and since the end of the Cold War, Europeans have been enormously reliant on US security commitments to Europe, particularly Article 5 commitments of NATO, which have basically forced the US to provide for continental defense of Europe. Some of us, I did some of my work, my early academic work on European security and defense. One of the reasons why Europe has not fully integrated in this field, it's one of the least integrated fields of policy in Europe at the moment, is precisely because this overwhelming US presence undid the incentives to integrate. Okay? By the way, integration is a very fancy word we use in Europe to say giving up sovereignty. Okay? So giving up sovereignty is very painful, and states don't do it very willingly unless they feel the cost of non-integration. Now, US withdrawal will elevate the cost of non-integration. It will become very evident when we begin to fail at the provision of security on the edges of the European order, whether it's North Africa or the East with Russia or the Arctic and other new spaces. So I think what you're going to see now is a huge push, I hope, towards integration in security and defense in Europe, higher defense spending, but I hope, and I wouldn't obsess about the 5%, 4%, I hope better spending. Europe is now spending, by the way, so you get a sense, EU member states, just close to 400 billion a year in defense spending. So this is 40% of the US defense, it's large defense budget. We're spending it in the wrong things. Okay? And then lastly, on the multilateral piece, just a phrase, we're seeing the undoing of the multilateral order. Again, I don't think we should be mincing words. The US is pulling out of UN agencies, is reducing its funding. The US used to be about between a fifth and a quarter of UN funding. So we're going to begin to see the stretching, if not the failure of the provision of certain public goods around the world that were provided by the UN and other institutions. And this is a challenge for Europe. So, and I'll finish with this. I think that, and there, by the way, whether Europeans come together and we try to fill that gap and provide a European pillar, big pillar within the UN system, and others is a huge question for us. So I think we have these two avenues. And for the Europe people in the room or people that are interested in Europe, I think the next 10 years, or between 5 and 10, will really be definitive of the European project. We can either splinter, and there are political movements, including the Patriots and various political parties in Europe that don't claim to be Eurosceptic, but in essence are forwarding agendas that would see the EU weakened. I think if we follow that route, we weaken the single market, we don't build a common security and defense policy, we don't construct a coherent foreign policy that is not unanimity-based, but majority-based when we build it, which is a key element moving forward, you will see European interests and values very poorly defended in the international scene. So it's curious that these political movements that we have in France, in Hungary, in Spain, in Germany, that they call themselves patriots, because in fact that patriotism will undo European sovereignty immensely, and we will be the objects of foreign policy, not the actors and crafters of global politics. The other avenue is one of integration. And if Europe integrates fully across these fields, it will be a major economic, security, diplomatic actor in the next 10 years. So that's what's ahead of us. And we can make bets of which path we're going to choose. I'm optimistic, but there are big challenges. So it's really pivotal moment for Europe right now.
Professor Byman, over to you. Feel free to respond to any of the points made, or also just set the foundation for the points you'd like to include.
So most of my work focuses on terrorist groups, civil wars, insurgencies. And if I were talking to a group like this 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, much of our discussion would be about this challenge, really what seems to be a challenge to the world. And these are present in different ways in almost every region. And what sort of threat do they present? But I want to go to Dean Hellman's remarks about poor framing. Right now we're seeing struggles in the name of counterterrorism that are very focused on Latin America. We're seeing this with, of course, Venezuela. We're seeing this with Mexico, where the terrorist framing is used, but doesn't actually fit. And part of this problem is that the United States now uses counterterrorism as a way of political signaling at home. So if you're treating something very seriously, if you're treating it as tough, the terrorism framework fits that very nicely. And a lot of what I believe we're seeing are statements by senior administration officials, the president himself, as a way of saying that the United States is getting tough on whether it's immigration or getting tough on narcotics trafficking by using a counterterrorism framework. And this doesn't work, however, in this context. And I should be clear, I do believe the US counterterrorism approach had many problems, but also many successes. And groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, which were very, very serious, are much lesser threats from an American point of view than they were in their heyday. And a lot of that is due to US counterterrorism efforts. But when we start to apply this more broadly outside of a fairly narrow terrorism framework, it starts to fall apart. And one of the big questions really revolves, let's be blunt, around killing people. And is it effective when you're going after organizations involved in narcotics trafficking? And for the most part, at least in the Americas context, the answer seems not only a very strong no, but that it's likely to backfire. And part of this is because of the nature of these organizations, where they are highly specialized, and the shift from killing leaders, which decentralizes groups, forces decision-making down, actually often makes them more efficient. And so what we've seen in the last 10 years is a remarkable degree of specialization in the international narcotics trafficking world, where we are seeing far more small groups that focus on often just moving a product from point A to point B, one particular aspect of the drug refinement process. And therefore, killing a few key individuals, or even a large number of individuals, actually doesn't work in terms of its impact on these organizations. But what makes it even more dangerous is, to me, the negative effects that come with it. One is that when you start to kill individuals, obviously you create, shall we say, leadership openings. You often create market competition. And in this context, that means more violence. And so we're going to see more violence, especially at a local level, in response to this. Another issue is that you're likely to see the death of innocent people. Now, this was always true from a counterterrorism point of view. And this is a very, I'll say, troubling and tricky issue. For those of you who followed the Gaza war, but who also followed the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, you know that all people are not created equal, right? That there's a tremendously different sort of attention given to human life depending on where you live in the world. And there were large numbers of people who died in Afghanistan and large numbers of people who died in Iraq, and that did not generate massive attention. And so the question in some ways is when we look at Venezuela, when we look at Mexico or other parts of the world, what sort of response will we see when innocent people start to die, often in response to military strikes? In Mexico in particular, the closeness of the United States and Mexico, the large number of dual nationals, the incredible family connections, to me make it likely that we are going to see a strong response in the United States if things start to get somewhat bloody in Mexico. Another issue is the possibility, at least, of a nationalist backlash. Right? This can often be overstated. Right? There were kind of endless statements about a nationalist backlash in Afghanistan in 2001 after 9/11 that largely didn't happen in the first few years. But given the rather, I'll say, I'm not sure what the right word is, tragic, sad, horrible, troubling record of the United States for military intervention in the Americas, you are highly likely to see a backlash against US military efforts that will make politics very, very difficult. The reason I want to stress this, and this will be my last comment, is so much of what really is counterterrorism is not going directly against terrorist groups from a US point of view. It's actually working with local governments. And while what gets the most attention is when things blow up, what is often far more consequential are security cooperation arrangements around the world. And this is sometimes intelligence, sometimes this is law enforcement, sometimes it's with local groups. But it's actually having local communities or local governments police themselves. And a lot of the more successful US efforts in the last 25 years have been empowering and strengthening local communities. And so what you want actually, if you're really going to treat drug cartels or other groups as more serious threats, is you actually want more cooperation from government. And that's tricky, right? There are those in this room, and I am not one, who are experts on US-Mexico relations and know how difficult that has been for both countries over the years. But when you start to create very, very strong political winds against the United States in these countries, it makes cooperation much more difficult. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to, Dean Hellman, come to you and pull together a little bit of what Professor Byman and Provost Muniz were talking about, because in these boat strikes in the Caribbean, largely from Venezuela, that we've been seeing in the last several weeks, these are unilateral US strikes. There's a lot of question over the legality of those strikes. We have not been shown any specific evidence that justifies the use of deadly force in those strikes. And even opinions among leaders certainly in South and Central America, but really around the world, are divided to this on some degree on how far the US should be able to go in this moment. But it's not just the strikes, right? It's been a complete change in the military posture. To Provost's point earlier, we've got military assets there, elite military units now, warships positioned in the region. It's a complete realignment for the US in terms of where they're focusing. How do you look at the US justification of those strikes, the purpose of those strikes? If it's counter-narcotics, counter-terrorism, the question then becomes, why isn't the US carrying out strikes across the border in Mexico, for example? A lot of reasons behind all of this, but how do you view that and the purpose behind those strikes?
Yeah, it's really hard to comment on, to give a coherent framework to a policy that has no coherence. What this administration in particular is doing, I think what all of the comments that were suggested here suggest kind of there were long-term shifts that have been going on. They have been exacerbated by this administration. But these things were happening before this administration. The kinds of things that you mentioned are really kind of specific and unique to this particular administration and the way it handles and engages in foreign affairs. I think first you have to understand that the policy-making process for foreign policy in the United States has essentially disintegrated. a National Security Council that brings together considered policy options to be discussed in an interagency process that brings coherent options to the president after sort of a significant vetting from all different sort of areas of government. That process is largely stopped. It's remarkable to think about it. It is probably one of the most significant changes that we have sort of seen in America in decades. And so there is no kind of coherent policy process that's generating these actions. What's generating these actions, and I think Dan had mentioned before, they are largely directed towards internal audiences, not towards an understanding of balance of power and other issues on the international stage. They are essentially, they are generated by personal preferences and personal who spoke to the president last and who's on the agenda of his meetings in the White House. And so it is very, very difficult to see any coherence to these strikes, except the one kind of consistent and coherent thing is it is put through the prism of how this is going to play for domestic political constituencies. As a result, the implications it has for our alliances, the implications it has for security and actually enhancing or weakening our security are, I don't even think, considered in the process. It's really just a kind of essentially a one-note band of like what is going to play well from the constituencies that I'm concerned about. So the implications are that it has all these negative consequences that are just not incorporated into the policy decisions. And I think the Venezuela story is a very good example of that.
I wonder, though, Professor Munoz, because the Venezuelan story also carries with it these accusations and allegations of attempts for regime change, which does not fit the rubric of an isolationist government or a president who promised America First policies, who seems to be looking more inwardly. So how do you view that and what message it sends to our allies?
Well, so being Spanish, sort of the Latin American dossier is very present in our debate, and particularly the Venezuelan dossier. It's a very complicated, very entrenched issue. I think there's no doubt that the regime is an abusive, repressive regime in Venezuela, and that it is using every means at its disposal to repress and persecute the opposition. And I think it's right that we build pressure on the regime to open up. Now, from the point of view of what this means for Europe, the change in US policy, I think what Joe was saying is correct. It's becoming very difficult to anticipate US foreign policy preferences across a whole range of issues. I disagree with Joe on one thing, which is, and I hope you invite me again if I disagree with you in public, but is because the China piece, I do think that is very structural. I think that the collision between the US and China does have elements of resemblance with the First Cold War. I think there is a very deep technological economic competition that is paired with geopolitical competition, mostly in the region, that drags other US allies into this. And I think there's a systemic political systems sort of model competition with the China system displaying actually very particular features of other authoritarian system enhanced by emerging technologies. So I think there are elements in there that really draw a very structural collision. I think it's getting extraordinarily hard to understand international affairs if you don't have the China-US collision as a lens to look at the world. Now, there are huge differences with the First Cold War, the fundamental one being the interdependence point. But my hunch, strong intuition, is that the security, the geopolitics will trump the economics. In fact, we're witnessing this as we speak. I mean, through the tariff war, through restrictions to the export of technology and critical components and materials, in a very economically illogical way. I mean, there's, the economic logic of these measures is zero, right? It's clearly counterproductive for both sides. So you're going to see slowly and perhaps then suddenly a process of decoupling of these two economies. It's going to take a long time and it's going to be painful, but this is where I think we are headed. And here, by the way, I think lies another of the enormous contradictions of US foreign policy. So it's not just that it shifts and it's hard to anticipate, but there is, in my mind, and I think when we look back at this period, we will assess it in these terms, which is the US seems to be quite committed to this very long structural challenge of managing China and to a large extent containing China's rise, but at the same time is deploying policies that are alienating allies left and right all over the world, including allies in the region. And the trade policy is the perfect example of this. So not only has the US not signed an FTA for I don't know how many decades now, but on top of that, it has deployed this barrage of indiscriminate tariffs across the world, hurting some of its most fundamental allies in the process. In indiscriminate ways. I mean, it's very hard to assess, where the affinity and alliance component has affected that decision. So, the Foreign Affairs had a very interesting number on this, titled "Who Needs Allies?" No, which is true. And by the way, these policies of weaponizing interdependence, because if someone is weaponizing interdependence at this moment, to some extent is the US government, and Europeans have been on the receiving end of this. In fact, just a footnote, and I'll come back to this, the Europe-US trade agreement that was signed and agreed upon recently in Europe is unthinkable if there hadn't been other layers of interdependence that really conditioned European thinking when coming to the table on security and on other fronts. No? But this weaponization of interdependence seems to be really working with either very weak countries that bend the knee to this, or allies that have these multi-layered interdependencies with the US. Not with the opponents. I mean, the Chinese are holding the line, the Russians are holding the line on these pressures. So it's within the Western bloc that this is working. So the foreign policy is hard to anticipate, including on the Venezuelan dossier. Two, there are structural drivers, and I would say the China-US one is the most structural of all. And three, this carries an immense contradiction within it, which is if that's your view of the world, where are your allies in all of that? And I don't see that in the policy.
Just to follow briefly on the military security front, obviously the stakes are highest right now because of the threat Russia poses in Ukraine and to the rest of Europe. But it's also true that the European security guarantee alone has never been enough to contain Russia or constrain its ambitions. Can that change now, even if there is the path of integration that's shared among European allies, or does the US have to be involved?
No. So we will have. I don't. Sort of. This is a crystal ball kind of thing. No, but we will have to fail at the provision of security on some elements in Europe in order to take the necessary steps to fully integrate.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, we weren't allowed to fail in the Balkans because the Americans stepped in, but we were basically unable to stop in the 90s a genocide on Europe's doorstep until the Americans intervened. We were very close to failing in Libya during the Gaddafi period until the Americans intervened. So we haven't been allowed to fail. I mean, this is, I'm not sure how self-serving this is a comment coming from a European, but I tell you, this policy, and I agree with the Trump administration on this policy of putting pressure on the Europeans and then actually withdrawing and forcing the Europeans to take over part of the provision of their security, I think will produce European security and defense integration. Now, if you look at the assets that Europe has, there's no doubt in my mind that if we put our mind to this, Europe has the infrastructure, we have the human capital, we have the industry, etc. We have the budgets and the financial resources to have very serious defense capabilities. But we need to stop investing in 27 different procurement processes, 27 kinds of defense systems, a non-integrated command and control structure. I mean, this needs to end. And I think it will, but it will take some time. And this is one of the big questions of the next 10 years that I was mentioning. Where will we be? I mean, if I had to do like a little table of, let's take the boxes of how much we move forward, this would be a big one there. How much integration have we seen in this space over the last 10 years?
Professor Byman, it strikes me we are speaking on the same day that a former terrorist leader, Ahmad al-Shara, is being welcomed here in the United States, was playing basketball over the weekend with many of the same leaders who've been trying to kill him for many years. And Dean Hellman mentioned sort of the rise of middle powers as well. I know your focus is much more on non-state actors, but in this moment of the undermining of the post-war alliance, the undermining of multilateralism, new alliances forming and breaking based on some of the leverage, economic leverage that the Trump administration's been doling out around the world. Where's the potential for non-state actors, for those middle powers, to exert themselves in new ways?
So going back to what Provost Munoz said, the American retreat from the world just leaves lots of openings. And some of these are on a broad stage, right? Whether it's European integration or questions, I was in Japan recently and they're stepping up cooperation with the Philippines on security issues, which is a huge step for the Japanese. So sometimes it's these dominant regional security issues, but often it's much more local. And there's tremendous opportunity for middle powers to do so. And a region I pay quite close attention to, we see this constantly now in the Middle East, where we have numerous powers, Israel, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, among others, that are regularly intervening in different conflicts in the area, whether that is Sudan or Libya, or of course various Israeli attacks on, I want to say 7 different parts of the Middle East in the last 3 years. So the middle powers are much more able to define their own security agendas. Whether you think this is good or bad is going to depend on your view, I think, of particular countries and particular regions. But it's a fundamental change, right? Where China doesn't really do alliances, right? They have relationships, but they don't have the kind of strong alliances that are going to lead them to impose their will far from their shore, outside very narrow areas, at least for right now. And the United States is actively and aggressively moving away from this. So I think we're seeing a relatively new era where middle powers have much more freedom. But the caveat is the United States is somewhat of a chaos actor. Right? So going to Dean Hellman's points about a lack of process, right? Where it's actually quite unclear to me what is going to come out of the White House in a given week. Right? And sometimes it's something I agree with. I actually think the U.S. support for the Bashar government in Syria is a sensible gamble. I would stress the word gamble when I think there are problems with the regime, but it's worth trying to do this. But frequently it's something utterly bizarre or surprising. 5 different U.S. administrations have worked extremely hard to cultivate India. And China was doing a fantastic job driving India into America's arms. And in a couple weeks of incoherence, we may have ruined that, right? I mean, decades of work. So I think that one of the challenges is going to be not just U.S. policies, but the unpredictability of the United States as an actor, where we can pursue policies that are inherently contradictory at the same time.
Dean Hellman, there's this very real criticism of the U.S. policy that we've heard. It's chaotic. You don't know what to expect week to week. But also long term. I mean, a lot of this uncertainty around where the U.S. would act or what they would do goes well before this Trump administration, well before even the first Trump administration. It's been this criticism that the U.S. will act in military or security interests in nations around the world, particularly in the global south, but not invest in them. These aren't long-term relationships, and they'll pick up and leave when they need to. And what we've seen in the last 15, 20 years is China filling that void, showing up in places where there aren't necessarily alliances to be built, but across Africa, across Latin America, across even the Middle East, I've heard anecdotally from a number of sources, they are investing in infrastructure. They are building long-term. There's an exertion of a different kind of economic soft power. Has that been a strategic mistake for the U.S. over these last, did that help get us where we are today, and does it further weaken the U.S. ability to lead on the global stage in the future?
Oh, I think it's been a tremendous strategic mistake on the part of the U.S., and that it predates the Trump era. And it goes back to something we were talking a little bit about earlier, which is that America fundamentally believed with the collapse of the Cold War, the first Cold War, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that America had an unchallenged hegemony, and that in that unchallenged hegemony, it could take whatever actions that it thought was beneficial to the United States. It could ignore the rise of middle powers who were demanding a greater voice in multilateral affairs. And one of the reasons for the weakening of multilateralism, with Manuel I completely agree with, is because the U.S. was not ready, and I think the Europeans to some extent in this as well, were not ready to open up the multilateral system to recognize the change in the structure of power, economic power, political power, and voice that had occurred over the last 50 years. And we're not in the Bretton Woods era anymore, and America was just not ready to accept that. Similarly, America thought that its power around the world was unchallenged because everyone was transitioning towards an American-centric way of seeing the global economy. And in this framing, and which I fundamentally have more problems with, this sort of framing of it's democracy versus autocracies, and that's the new form of competition. And democracies will ultimately sort of have the sway because it's a system that is more attractive to individuals and gives them more freedom. And I think in that view, it ignored all the points that you mentioned of how China was using its transactional diplomacy in a very different way. I agree with Dan also that China doesn't really build alliances. China engages in transactions. But the sum total of that transactions was it was pulling more and more people away from a notion that there is just one dominant player in the world. So I think America has just been kind of asleep at the wheel. Part of it was maybe it was asleep in the wheel because it was drunk on its own power, to mix metaphors. But it really just did believe that it didn't need to do the hard work of building alliances with the middle powers. It didn't need to do the work of continuing to strengthen our alliances with our core allies. And it didn't really need to do the work of competition around the world with China, which was investing billions in the kinds of infrastructure that countries wanted and asked for, even at the price for those countries of losing sovereignty. So I think America's lost a lot of that, the dynamism and momentum, and has only woken up to the fact now that it's a very, very different world, a very, very different structure of power, and a very different structure of competition, and it needs to adjust. And this administration doesn't see the world in that systemic way. It's just gut reaction to individual things and not a strategic reaction to how the world has changed.
But just to follow on the autocracy-democracy debate, because we do hear that a lot now as well, that this is the current power struggle, and then the autocratic forces are actually ascendant, not just here, but around the world. Do you disagree with that framing right now?
Well, I certainly agree that there is an increasing level of authoritarianism. And it is more and more countries are kind of moving in that direction. What I disagree with is this framing of the global order in terms of it's us Democrats versus those guys who are autocrats. Again, it goes back to the framing issue. We just like to think things in very simple terms. And that's a great story to tell. It's the Democrats are fighting the autocrats. We just had a talk here the other day with the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Russia, who just came out with a book called Autocrats versus Democrats.
I just read it, which is why I'm asking.
And it's like the whole world can be understood, and I think this was the great failure of the Biden administration's foreign policy, that framing the world in terms of a competition between political systems, Democrats versus autocrats. I don't believe that really jives with the economic interdependencies that have occurred in the world. Yeah. I don't believe that it reflects the changing voice and influence around the world of different players. And I also don't think there's a clear threshold that you can say, here are the democracies and here are the autocracies, because there are these pressures in our own country as well, here in the United States, where these things are playing themselves out, tendencies are playing themselves out. Yeah. So I just think it's the wrong framing. It doesn't help us get to understanding where the global order might be going.
You wanted to jump in, please. Yeah.
Two quick comments on this issue of the global south, because again, coming from Spain, we're a country anchored in the north. We're EU members, NATO members, full democracy. But part of our soul is in the south. No? I mean, sort of in Latin America, and parts of Africa, parts of Asia. And if you look at the figures, actually at the macroeconomic figures and others, the G7, the early 90s was about 70% of the global economy. Today is just upwards of 40%. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge shift of economic heft and everything that comes with that, with investment, expenditure in defense, and diplomatic muscle that is moving away from the traditional actors, which are mostly in the north. I was just looking at the Goldman Sachs 50-year projections for the global economy, which are very noisy because, I mean, it's 5 decades out. But if you look at the world's largest economies, basically you have the US and China, the EU, if you treat it as a single economy, around 50 odd trillion, the Indian economy around 52 trillion. By the way, the Indian economy today is the size roughly of the UK, so 3 point something. The UK in 50 years will be 7 point something, and India will be 50 odd. So you're going to be in a world where a couple of the major economic actors are arguably in the south, most certainly India, which considers itself as one of the leaders of the global south. Now, there's also something very interesting, which is the global south seems to be quite committed to the interdependent, integrated international system that Joel described as disintegrating. So they're very much pro-trade. They worry very much about the development agenda, the climate agenda, so they're very committed to that system. In fact, they're very, very critical of this very simple black and white view of the world of the China-US collision, because they say to you, if you go to Mexico, to South Africa, to Indonesia, to Delhi, and you say to them that the overriding singular feature of the international system is a new global Cold War, they'll say, what the hell? I mean, here you are again dragging us to this collision, which I think is real, but I don't think it will be the single feature of the international system when we don't want it, because we're going to pay an immense price if you take us down this road on issues that are vital to us. So a lot of the governance in the 21st century will actually emerge in the global south and in the north-south dialogue. So if we are moving to a system, I think it'll be more fractured. It'll be highly conditioned by the US-China collision, but the global south will have a growing voice, maybe not as coherent as we would wish. And if you want to, if you want to see what that challenge of that looks like, look at the BRICS communiques, the BRICS summits and things like that. They're all over the place. But there is a voice emerging on this. On the democracy point, just a quick thing, also to reinforce something Joel said. It's not clear cut. I mean, this very simplistic view of the world, democracies, autocracies, misses completely the immense spectrum of grays that we have in political systems. But there is one feature, which is, I think this is the 16th or 17th year in a row of democratic regression globally. And now what's typical, it's not for a country like Norway to become North Korea. I mean, what's typical is for this slippery slope of degrading of democratic institutions and imperfect democracies emerging in place of more perfect democratic systems. Now, this trend, if you ask me, is concerning because it takes us to a more illiberal equilibrium in the international system. So not only is the order fracturing internationally, attacking and putting at risk international liberal institutions like global trade, porous borders, cosmopolitanism, international law. I mean, these are all very liberal sort of international projections of liberal values, but also traditional liberal in a very broad traditional sense, actors in the international system are becoming less so. So they're beginning to deploy foreign policies that are actually deeply liberal. I mean, a lot of the undoing of the international trading system is being done by the actors that built and sustained the international trading architecture. A lot of the undermining of the human rights regime, a lot of the undermining of the multilateral regime. So it's kind of fascinating that we're at this point in the international order where we have these two tendencies are converging, a much more fractured, less integrated, more liberal international system, and then these traditionally liberal and active actors that are becoming the undoers of the system. It's kind of fascinating. We don't know what the new equilibrium is going to look like, but I think it'll be less democratic, less liberal, less integrated, and we need to navigate that space.
What's your take on this? The undoing of many of these same systems, the decline, the degradation of democratic ideals around the world. What does that mean for the non-state actors in particular, but also for the non-great powers?
So this broader question to me of how the systems are changing. When I open the newspaper and get depressed about the state of America, I then go a little further into the newspaper and get depressed about the state of the world, right? That it is something much broader. It is something that is, I'll say, striking. I'll confess my own naivete. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, I was very much part of the view that there was this kind of broader long-term change going on, and every 5 to 10 years you would see a slight shift in a positive direction, but over time, over a lifetime, that becomes a profound shift in the global order. And unfortunately, I'm much more pessimistic about that than I was before. But for most middle powers and small powers, they're often trying to grab onto resources that they can use not only to bolster their state, but to preserve their regime. And something that I just criticized the Trump administration for doing, which is to look at national security from a domestic political lens, is something much more natural for many small and middle powers around the world. And one thing that really is an opportunity for China is its ability to bolster regimes, especially undemocratic regimes. So China is doing major economic investments around the world, as you mentioned, but one of its main exports to main regimes is also surveillance technology and internal security. And this is a mass market that is allowing regimes to become much stronger against their own people. And so to me, one of the likely changes that we're seeing, what we are seeing now, but I think is likely to continue, is the increased ability of governments to repress their own people. And that doesn't mean it's going to happen in every place, every time. But I do think the technological balance has shifted where technologies that were once seen as sources of freedom are actually now seen as enabling authoritarianism. And so I do think a number of these regimes, both at the local level and some of the bigger powers, are going to use these in ways that hurt the broader democratizing process.
The stakes for all of this, obviously, when we're talking about great power conflict, we're talking about the undoing of the traditional multilateral organizations, the decline of small d democratic ideals around the world. The stakes are great military conflict, right? That is the sort of great fear everyone carries that both informs a lot of US foreign policy and other nations' policy, but also what we're talking about in terms of where the world goes next. And I think just to address it head on as the elephant in the room, how worried are each of you? We're seeing now, look, we've just seen 2 brutal years of war in Gaza after the Hamas attacks. You've seen Russia continue its war in Ukraine with a very uncertain future. You've also got the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet unfolding in Sudan. There's no clear end to a lot of the ongoing conflict, and yet you've also have China potentially watching what unfolds in Ukraine to see if they're allowed to act in Taiwan, how the rest of the world might potentially respond. And I think the answer is we don't know, which is a terrifying answer in a lot of ways. So, Dean Hellman, how do you look at the potential for all of these new forces to spill over into some great military conflict, the likes of which we have not seen in decades?
Well, yeah, to end on an optimistic note.
Yeah.
I'm very worried. Look, in a situation of great structural change in the global economy, in a situation in which there are new powers that are sort of seeking their rightful kind of place in the global order, at a time in which the level of certainty is radically reduced, creating just a lot of openness towards potential change, increasing the level of risk. And when you have a dominant player, the United States, still, because whatever changes that have occurred in the world order, America's capacity on the security front is still extraordinary. At a time in which many of the kind of core processes which were designed to prevent risk seem to have kind of collapsed. I worry very much that this is the kind of volatile tinder that creates possibilities for a serious conflict. I also worry that, and this goes back to an earlier point, the fact that we are focused so much on great power competition, we are not looking at the longer term risks associated with the demographic sort of shifts globally around the world that are leading to this tremendous youth bulge in Africa, tremendous youth bulge. This week, actually, Nigeria's births exceeded all of European Union's births, one country in Africa. So it is suggesting that the fact that we are seeing just a tremendous demographic bulge at a time of economic difficulty, indebtedness, lower investments in health education, less progress on sustainable development goals, means that we're also creating a tremendous amount of risk outside the great power framework, which, if it intersects with the great power competition, creates a lot of really worrying prospects.
Just a reflection on this. So I agree with Joel and his assessment. So I think we're moving into an international environment that, as I was saying before, is more fractured, more volatile. So in fact, it is becoming more normal. I think we're going to look back at the past 30 years and realize how extraordinary they were in how much interdependence they produced, how much integration internationally they produced. They were also very extraordinary, and I think, by the way, we make a mistake in the IR, in the international relations field, to confuse the international order to some extent with a very singular moment in history when we had a unipolar world with a hegemonic actor, which was the US, on its economic size, its military size, its willingness to build, to underwrite, and to be constrained by an international system that it had created. And we're now beginning to understand what the implications are of that heft being eroded in relative terms. So, you know, the size of the US economy compared to the global economy is contracting, power is moving to other places, and the US is clearly growingly unwilling to be constrained by that system that it created. So part of this disorder is linked to both a change in the structure of power and a change in US attitudes to the international system itself. So we're moving to this much more volatile space. Now, about a great conflict, I think what we will begin to see, and I think we're already seeing this, is a growing failure challenge of provision of global public goods, like I said. So this is safety of sea lanes, implementation of international law in different places, peacekeeping. So you will begin to see instability in the edges of the system, the Sudans of the world, areas in the Middle East, in Central Asia, etc. That's where the noise will begin, and it'll be costly for others. I don't see in the short term major power competition, which would basically be in the Strait of Taiwan and maybe some China, US. I mean, that's probably the most likely place, possibly in Eastern Europe. But I think that's, but you don't need to go all the way there to realize that the world is much more like the world before 1990 than the world between 1990 and right around the date of the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's a more normal world, but for those of us sitting here who've been living for 30 years in this extraordinary international environment, it feels like a major change.
Please.
Just to briefly add one more element of volatility, the leadership of many of the major powers is much more personalized. And whether that's the United States or Russia or China or India, much depends on the thoughts and perceptions of an extremely small number of people. And there you just get the tremendous risk of miscalculation, of ego replacing national interest, of political systems that are not designed to give full and open information, but instead flatter leaders and their perceptions. What that means in any particular context is going to vary, but it increases the risk of conflict because often risks are less likely to be conveyed, and especially risks to ordinary people who are the ones who are likely to suffer physically as well as economically.
So terrifying, scary, worrying. We've covered that. I'm going to turn to the audience in just a moment for questions. Before I do, I can't leave I responsibly cannot leave the conversation there. But I do like to ask people who think so deeply on these topics and are clearly much more well-read on all this than I am, where is it that you're finding any sign of hope or optimism that things will not tip over into the worst case scenarios that I know we all have to consider and report on and study? But where are the small moments where you think, this is something that can be built on, this is a guardrail that exists, all is not lost yet? We'll just go down the line, and then please have your questions ready. I think if we start lining up at the microphone, we can begin to take people in turn. Please.
So there is the one issue that really puzzles me, and that is a source of optimism, which is that we've never been more prosperous than we are today. So if you look at the macro figures, right, we're record levels of GDP in this country, in most of Europe. So a lot of the drivers of this instability, particularly the domestic drivers in the Western world, sort of the rise of very polarized politics and very polarized leadership, is really a failure of the management of abundance, right? So we're failing at the management of prosperity, which is it's a source of optimism for me, because it means that this is not a scarcity issue, a violence issue per se. There's something to the way we've been governing the process of change over the last 20, 30 years that is producing this very volatile domestic leadership that is then producing all of these ripples that as international relations people we tend to focus on. So that for me is a source of solace in the sense that we can build more equitable, we can build societies that function better and that produce a better leadership. If across the Atlantic we were able in the US and Europe to recommit to the transatlantic alliance, to our shared projection of our values and our interests globally, I think the world would look very different. And I think there'll be more stability and more security. But for that, we need to fix some of our domestic politics issues, which in my mind go back to fixing our economics, to be frank, because there is a huge correlation between the malfunctioning of our economies. And by malfunctioning, I mean the hollowing out of the middle of our income distribution, so the hollowing out of our middle class, and the hollowing out of our middle of the political spectrum. So these things are correlated. So the economics for me and the innovation are a source of optimism, but we need to govern that process well.
I think there are two sources of optimism I would push. One is something that Manuel mentioned earlier, I fully agree with, which is middle powers are just not going to play the game. So India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, these are new sources of power. They're still trying to understand how best to exercise that power. Manuel is also right that they have not yet thought about how they could coalesce in the international sort of system. But there are sort of similarities, echoes that they all have, which is they refuse to be hived off into these two different camps. And I think they have a lot of power now, and they're learning how to exercise that power. And when they do learn to exercise that power and think about how they could unite on areas of common concern, then I think that could be a positive force. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is where I'll disagree with Manuel, I don't believe, because of the level of economic interdependence, I just think that it's a fool's game to think that the US and China can kind of essentially disintegrate their economies. That just, it's politicians talk about it, we talk about friendshoring, we talk about economic nationalism. I just think that we have got to a point where, yes, there is a weaponization element to this interdependence. We have been living in a very, very strong era of growth. When threats to that growth, when the disintegration of the economy creates sort of serious economic challenges, I believe that level of interdependence is going to come back to support new ways of thinking about how we get out of the economic difficulties that are created. So right now, for example, on tariffs, we haven't hit the worst impacts of the tariffs. If we do, I think there's going to be a response globally. So I do think that the level of economic independence is so great that I do think it'll be a source that ultimately pushes others together to think for new solutions.
Briefly, I began by talking about how in the past, if I were speaking to an audience like this, I would be discussing the threat of global jihadist terrorist groups. And that is a problem that has not been solved, but it's been greatly reduced. And there's no question that a threat that obsessed the United States and several other countries for many years has diminished. A second thing, and this is grimmer, but I think important, is the Russian aggression against Ukraine did not succeed. Now, it hasn't failed, but if you look at the world, the United States, Europe, Ukrainians, of course, themselves, coming together and resisting aggression, that not only sends a message to Russia, but also sends a broader message that conquest is very hard, and that if you are going to use force, there's a risk of other countries banding together to make this less likely to succeed, and that's a very powerful message. And the last, and here really my colleagues up here know much more than I do, we've seen in the last 30, 40 years a tremendous transformation in humanity where the global middle class, if we want to call it that, the developed world, is transformed. And the majority of human beings do not live in poverty. And that's a staggering accomplishment, right? And there's always a question of what we're going to look back on when we look at this era. But that may be one of them, which is for all of human history, it's been a very small number of humans who were able to enjoy the blessings of prosperity. And that has changed, and that comes with new tensions and new problems, but it's still a tremendous success.
Necessary notes of hope from all three of you. Thank you so much. So we'll open it up to the room. If you have a question, please just raise your hand. We've got two right here in the front, and I think we can bring the microphone around to the gentleman in the red tie, if you don't mind first.
Yeah, Elcio Santana, I teach at class here. My question has to do with assuming the reconfiguration of Europe in the next 10 years. The question is how the relationship of Europe with some other regions, what role could that play? For instance, if you look at Latin America, that's where you have the largest reserve of rare earth.
Yes.
On the other hand, that's where investments on green energy, for instance, are ready to be made if China doesn't take it over. So how do you see this, the reconfiguration, and how does that play with other regions?
I believe that's a question for you.
So, I mean, as a Spaniard, we have seen Latin America. We see Latin America as part of the West. I mean, this is, it's the way that we read international affairs. And by the way, I think this is also a very interesting question for this conference and for the wonderful work that Georgetown does on the region, which is not, there is a tendency when people look at Latin America to sort of break it up into countries. So some of the dialogue around this is like hopping from one country to another, looking at the particularities of each country, which is always interesting. And Latin America is a huge sort of mine of diversity, in the way political systems work and their economies work. But what's really interesting, if you ask me now, is what is the role of the region going to be in global politics? How does the China-US collision, for example, affect the region? And I mean, this is not a spoiler, immensely, right? I mean, I was just in Argentina. I was there when Milei was here signing, the agreement with the Treasury Secretary and the President on the intervention of the peso. It is almost impossible to understand that agreement if you don't look at the geopolitics of the region. I mean, it has China written all over it, watermarked. It was about a port that the Chinese were going to build in Tierra del Fuego. It was about, the Chinese actually applying for a strategic project on mining. It's about, it's about the gas and oil reserves in Argentina. So this geopolitical question of the region is essential. Now, my own take, and I think this has been consistent of Spain, and Spain has carried a significant voice in Europe, is we would be significantly better off if the region was linked through trade, through investment, through higher education, through culture to Europe tightly. So we've been defending the EU-Mercosur agreement almost from the inception of the agreement. Thankfully, it seems, I mean, if I had to make a bet, I think finally we're going to get this thing through in Brazil. And we've been trying to convince our colleagues that this is much more than a trade deal, that this is really geopolitical in its scale. And we should have a list of significant agenda items on the international agenda that we deal with Latin America as a bloc as much as we can on these. And trade is one, critical materials and component is another, international security and organized crime is clearly another, international business is another big topic. I mean, all of these, multilateralism and some of the issues on the multilateral agenda should be another. So that is my take. I think this would do good to the region, even though it's complicated sometimes to orchestrate the region itself. I mean, for the region to come together with consensus on things. That is my view on things. And I think, again, the world would look significantly better if there was a strong Latin America-Europe connection. There is another piece in this puzzle, by the way, now, which is clearly growingly Canada as well. So the Canadians are trying to both strengthen their relationship with Europe and also with Europe and Latin America. There's a curious figure here, which is America is about 13-14% of global trade. So, if the U.S. wants to cut itself off from global trade through these very pervasive and generalist tariffs, that doesn't mean 80-odd% of the remaining of global trade has to do the same. And Latin America, the Canadians, the Europeans are all in the same boat on this, for example, to give you an example, right? So I would really elevate the level of the strategic dialogue, Europe, Latin America, and I think that would do a lot of good, and we would find a lot of commonalities across the agenda. That has been, I think, the Spanish view for a long time. I served in the Spanish government for a while. That was clearly the case then, and I think it still is today.
Anything you'd like to add? No? We'll move on. I think there's another question right here. Yes, right in front.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I would like your opinion on a very particular subject that I think is in everybody's mind, at least in the impact it has on people's lives in the region, especially in the Caribbean region, which is climate change. We just experienced, we provide 50% of the power of Jamaica, for example. We had a 60 megawatt solar farm that is no longer in existence because the eye of the hurricane passed right over it. And this is a constant threat to the Caribbean. The Caribbean region has about 200 million people. If you do not include some of the U.S. states which got affected, Florida, Texas, Alabama, the Carolinas. So this is a serious problem, and the current administration has pulled out of the Paris Accords. The current administration is promoting the drill, baby, drill, coal, etc. And we've been working for years in trying to get away from fossil fuels and migrate our different energy production to clean energy, whether it be solar, geothermal, or wind. So the fact that this is a calamity that affects a lot of, especially in the areas I mentioned, but it does affect a good part of the United States, and it affects a good part of Europe. And to give you an idea, the Caribbean Sea, which we monitor very carefully, is 2.5 degrees warmer this year than last year. Mm-hmm. And Melissa stood still for about 5-6 days and just sucked up a lot of water and dumped all this water, Haiti and Dominican, and then went on to Jamaica with 300-kilometer-an-hour winds. So I'd like to hear what you see as the future of humanity when there's really no, real policy. I think the only government official that's from the United States that's going to Brazil for the COP is Gavin Newsom, because he announced he was going to go to that. But I don't think any. I'm not promoting Gavin Newsom, but I'd like to hear your opinion on this.
Who would like to take that first?
Well, I can start. Well, first of all, I agree with your assessment about how damaging it is that the United States has reversed course on this issue. On the optimistic side, I would say that this seems to me one of the areas that is most amenable towards kind of snapping back after the administration serves out its term, assuming that it doesn't continue beyond its term. That's right, unless it goes for a third term. And why do I say that? There are some things, damage that this particular administration has done, that it's going to be very, very hard to snap back and reestablish the status quo ante. On the development agenda in particular, the damage that has been done, the closure of USAID, the trying to regenerate American enthusiasm for providing aid and assistance and development and poverty reduction efforts, despite the extraordinary success that Dan mentioned. I think that will be very, very difficult to even reestablish once this administration moves on and the normal process of the democratic competition leads to a new approach. On climate, actually, I do think that this is really largely related to the personification and the personalization of leadership, the strange way in which Trump has been able to kind of create and reimagine the Republican Party, which I think is very related to him and his personal viewpoints. And I think that the continuing damage that these events are going to cause, the overwhelming scientific evidence and as much disinformation as you want to throw to it, means that this is one area, I think, where when the administration changes, I would not be surprised to see a kind of sharp shift in American policy, which I hope will then begin to address it. We still lost out on critical years, there's no question about it. And the credibility of the US as an actor will always be now questioned because that strain is there. But I do think it's probably more susceptible to sort of pushback and change when the administration changes. I hope.
I really worry that, if you look at how politics has evolved in a lot of the Western countries over the last 20, 30 years, this process that I was mentioning before of the hollowing of the middle of our political spectrum is actually quite consistent. In the US, it's very marked. I don't know if you guys have seen, so Pew has been running polls on the ideological preferences of American voters across both political parties, and they grade themselves from 0 to 10, 5 being sort of in the center of the political spectrum. And these curves of Republicans and Democrats used to overlap quite significantly in the sort of 4, 5, 6 area. And then they had tails on both extremes. But these curves have been moving, and they barely overlap now. So the center is actually quite weak. And a lot of the elections are not played, they're not decided in the center. And this also shows in bipartisan legislative initiatives in Congress and others. This is not unique to the US. This has happened in France and in Spain and in many other places. I link this very directly to the erosion of our middle class. I think it's very hard to sustain a deliberative, moderate democratic system if you have people that are enormously precarious, that worry about the future and the future of their kids day in, day out. I think this really pushes the vote to the extremes. And I think one of the victims of that process is the climate change agenda and fight. And it is a victim because this is very elite driven in its assessment, in its scientific assessment, and in the policy implementation of this. And it's also very contingent on us engaging globally on these things. And the extremes are enormously suspicious of international engagement, so they're very unilateralist. They want to disengage from the international system. So I really focus most of my own work and writing on this on the disappearance of our middle of the spectrum, even though I think the climate change threat is maybe the most existential, because unless we address the underlying driver of this polarization in our countries, we are simply going to continue to produce a type of political leadership that will deprive us of the tools and the impetus to address the climate crisis. So I agree with Joel that the cost of this will be enormous, but the capacity of these extremes to undermine the agenda is great. I mean, this country is an example of this, but this is playing out in Europe across our electoral system. So I would bring back the focus. I know it's very tempting to look at the policy areas and try to address each of them in isolation. But I think the big feature of the last 20, 30 years in our politics is the rise of the extremes. And that rise will affect policy agenda across a whole range of topics. And if we don't address the underlying drivers, we're really going to be focused just on the ripples of this, trying to address the consequences and not the underlying drivers. I also worry that the policies of this administration in this country, some of them will be very pro-growth. I think they're very pro-growth on deregulation and on taxation, but I think they will exacerbate the crisis of the American middle class, which will produce the political pendulum to swing even more violently moving forward. And these technical, highly sophisticated issues that requires trust in elites, effective governance, effective international cooperation will be damaged in the process. And it's not just climate. I mean, it's climate, it's trade, I mean, there's a multilateralism writ large. Yeah.
If I could just bring Professor Bynum in on this, one of the pieces of this not being that the issues live alone is the security aspect to climate risk and climate crises when they occur. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Joint Chiefs chairman would brief on global threats, and climate change was one of the biggest security risks facing America. Have we lost that thread of the conversation entirely?
I think the answer actually is yes, we have lost that thread. I mean, and it's surprising in part because, just as one example, the climate change in the Arctic region is fundamentally transforming geopolitics, where you have Russia, Canada, China to a degree, all trying to increase influence as a result of tremendous change going on. This broader question of climate change, depending on what parts of the world you know and focus on, it's not a future question, it's a how long question. So for the Middle East, where I've spent a lot of my professional energy, the Middle East has been dealing with the effects of severe climate change for decades now. And it's fundamentally transforming demographics, it's changing economics. And to kind of bring together some of our earlier conversation, it's one of the costs of this broader change we're seeing in the world. There's no country in the world that is rich that does not use a lot of energy, right? Some use more than others, but they all use a lot. And that fundamental tension, there's a bit of good news in that market-oriented solutions have actually made tremendous progress, but we still haven't resolved the how do you get countries to act against their own immediate economic interest question, which is exceptionally difficult, right? And the US certainly has moved backward, but I don't see countries as largely having had success in this area. And the question going to the Caribbean or any other part of the world really is, if you think about what a potential equilibrium is in 20 years, how do you get societies to survive in that equilibrium when the global temperature is 2 or 3 or 4 degrees Celsius higher, when sea levels are higher, when you have desertification in many formerly fertile areas? And in some areas, governments will be competent and able to help their citizens mitigate this, but in a lot of areas, it's going to put tremendous stress on countries that are already under tremendous pressure.
I think we probably have time for a couple more questions. Yes, sir? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eduardo Porter. I write a column for The Guardian. I wanted to press you a little bit about how Latin America should play this moment. I think the idea of a coordinated regional response seems to me unrealistic. You have very, very different interests, as you can see now. Mexico's 50% tariff on China kind of shows you where it feels it's going. But further south, I think that the question is much more alive. You pointed out that China was written all over the deal between the US and Argentina, but in a way, Argentina is hedging its bet. Argentina did not, as far as I understand, do away with the swap line it had with Beijing as a response to the $20 billion offered by the United States. China is still a bigger trading partner for Argentina than the United States is. And this is true of many Latin American, there's more exports to China than there are to the United States. This is also true of Brazil, it's true of Chile, I believe, it's true of a variety of countries. And so for them, the question is actually very, very, very difficult, because the United States is going to ask them to take sides, and I expect that Beijing will ask them too. And so they're going to be trapped in this moment, and I don't know if this is an opportunity to play one side off the other, or if the stakes are too high and they will in fact have to choose. So this idea that there is this opportunity for Latin America, and maybe this is true of other regions of the global south, to kind of like try to coordinate a response that works around the United States, say some happy WTO minus the US world, seems to me unrealistic. There's a collective action problem here that is going to lead people into different pockets in this conflict. So I'd just love to hear you maybe recommend a policy to some of these countries.
Yeah, well, on the WTO, we've managed to bypass the blockage of the appellate body of the WTO with a parallel set of rules. So, I mean, there are moves in this direction. On the region, you're right to point out that it's very hard to come up with a coherent and consistent agenda on the foreign policy front for the region. So this is a challenge for Latin America. Now, the way I think that this is going to play out is the following. So on the economic front, China's presence is overwhelming. So you mentioned the figures for Argentina. As a destination of Argentinian exports, China is much, much larger than the US. For Chile, Chile exports to China more than it does to the US and the EU combined at this moment. So, I mean, across the region, it's very rare to see a country, I think Mexico is the exception, that trades more with the US than it does with China. There's also a shift in investment patterns. So if you look at the stock of investment that China has in these places, it's not just trade, it's investment. And there is a shift in very particular places on the lending front. So China now has the largest stock of lending to governments. In fact, around the world, it's larger than the IMF, it's larger than the World Banks, is larger than the Club of Paris countries put together. And many of the big recipients are in Latin America. Now, how this is going to trickle down to diplomatic influence is, I think, a fascinating question for people to look into, because it's unclear. I mean, this is unprecedented in over 100 years for the region and for many places around the world. So it's unclear how this will affect their foreign policies. What I would expect is that most countries are going to try to navigate this gray space of continuing to engage with the Chinese on trade and on investment and on infrastructure projects. If you go to Colombia, you go to Argentina, and you ask them, how has the experience been of doing business with the Chinese? Many times they'll tell you, well, you know, at least they came and they built the infrastructure, they're bidding contracts, they're active in the region. I remember this very vividly when I was in government. I would get all of these folks from Latin America coming over from governments and also from multilateral financial institutions, you know, the IDB and others, and they would say to us, look, you haven't come to a capital increase in I don't know how many years, your companies are not bidding for the rail network in Bogota or for this infrastructure here, and there's a Chinese bidding and getting these things done. So I think a lot of these countries will be very reluctant to give this up. And even the Milei government has been careful not to fully alienate the Chinese relationship, even though the Milei government right now is by far the most significant beachhead that the US government has in the southern part of Latin America, very, very clearly. Now, I think that the sustainability of this policy will be dependent on the severity of the China-US collision. So depending how intense that is, the pressure to take sides will be greater or less pronounced. I'm of the opinion that it will be growingly unsustainable for countries to play arbitrage across these two relationships, and a lot of pressure will be put on them to reduce their exposure to one or the other, depending on who's asking. It's unclear to me I think it's very unlikely that China will be fully expelled from the region because of US action or even European growing presence, so that they'll try to navigate this space, but with growing difficulty and tensions. I mean, on the Argentinian
distaste of the transactional way in which China engages. I mean, although people are happy to get the funding, and there's a lot of discomfort that you see in many, many countries about the way in which they interact with China. So I think that that is going to push countries to try to think about how they interact in a very different way. So in answer to your question, I think the issue is not when does the West finally embrace Latin America? It's when does Latin America stop thinking about the world through the vision of and through the lens of the West and start thinking about how it engages collectively, as the previous question sort of suggests, and I think that's going to take a lot of time. But also, if you look at these other fora, which have been ineffective, BRICS and these new development institutions and things like that, they've gone nowhere consistent and coherent. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible to think that those fora could have new life. And I think the insults associated with the Trump administration are going to breathe new lives into some of that effort.
Professor Bauman, you get the last word. Please don't terrify us. Too bad.
My colleagues have spoken much more eloquently about this than I'd be able to. But I would say that for the last 35 years, maybe longer, there's been, I would say, a need for the United States to be paying more attention to Latin America. And now we're in the be careful what you wish for, right? Where the region is much more at the center of U.S. policy than it's been in my professional lifetime, but probably in a very negative way. And so this is obviously a missed opportunity, but I'm actually even more concerned not about missing the opportunity, but about 10, 20 years from now, having to kind of dig out and not just have what's on the table still be on the table, but have it be much harder, whether it's increased Chinese influence or just greater regional resentment of a very aggressive and perceived hostile U.S. role.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Bauman, Joel Hellman, and Manuel Muniz. And thank you all for being here today. Hand it back over to Denise.
Thank you, Amna, for your great work moderating this panel. I would like to welcome to the stage the panelists of our next session, China's Worldview. As you saw, China is a recurrent theme when you're looking at the world, so it's a great transition to our panelists.